Awesome. Good day, everyone. My name is Natalie DeLapp. I'm the Operations Director for Humboldt County Growers Alliance. HCGA is the trade association representing licensed cannabis businesses within Humboldt County. And we are pleased to bring you a whole week worth of education at this Cannabis Genetics and Bioethics Conference, which is produced in partnership with Hendricks Farms. A big thank you to Daniel Hendricks, who is here. Hello, Daniel. Thank you. Every day this week, we have held different workshops. On Monday, we held microfarming. Tuesday, viruses, viroids, and pathology. On Wednesday, tissue culture and meristematic restoration in cannabis. On Thursday, genetic editing for yield and stress tolerance. And earlier today, genetic storage for common access. All of those panels have been recorded and we're in the process of uploading them to our website at hcga.co. So if you missed any of this week's panels, do check it out. And today we are excited to bring to you the Cannabis Breeders' Rights and Bioethics panel. We have Eleanor Kunst, Sunshine Johnson, Colleen Byers, Nat Pennington, Jesse Dodd, Jerry Whittington to talk about all of the exciting panels, tips, techniques, practices, and applications that we discussed this week and debate their application for cannabis breeders and small farmers. And I want to introduce my colleague, Heather Luther, to talk briefly about how we're able to bring you all of this free programming. So with that, Heather.
Thanks, Natalie. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So we've been able to bring this conference to you all week long thanks to our sponsors. So I want to give them a really big thanks. That's Tag Risk Insurance, Rocky Mountain Cannabis Consulting, Rad Source Technology, Volks Amendments, and the Humboldt Community Business Development Center. Today's sponsor is, well, I also want to talk about our Allied Business Program with the Growers Alliance, which all of these sponsors are allied industry business members with HCGA. So while HCGA works on behalf of our licensed cannabis members, we're supported in part by businesses that value our members and our mission. So becoming an allied business of HCGA provides you with year-round direct access to our membership with our online communication platform through weekly webinars and in person at our conferences and workshops. It's a way to learn about the cannabis industry, develop new business leads, to revisit existing customers, to strengthen client relationships and brand your company name. The Allied Business Program is also a place where manufacturers, distributors, and retailers from out of Humboldt County can participate and engage with Humboldt County licensed operators, including our Business Source Cannabis online platform. So again, one last warm welcome to all of you. And I think this is going to be a great panel. Thanks for being here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Heather. And with that, I'd like to introduce my partner in crime, Daniel Hendricks, who has put together this entire week's worth of educational programming to introduce this panel. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Natalie. I appreciate it. I just wanted to correct Jerry Whiting. That's one of the names. I just want to give that name correction. But everybody, thank you so much for being here. The idea of the final panel here is to really kind of put together this Supreme Court of judges on what we've learned and all the topics that we've addressed this week. It's some of the stuff is very interesting and very powerful. All of it can really change the way cannabis genetics operate and all of our farms and how they operate. So we love all of these people. I do personally, and I think that they're excellent people to voice some of the opinions, and we really want everybody to get involved and help us shape the policy through discussion. So thank you, everybody. And I'll introduce Colleen, who's gonna do a much better job than anybody could ever imagine to host this panel. So thank you.
No pressure. Thanks, Daniel. I am Colleen Byers, and I work with independent breeders at Breeders Best with the team, including Dale Hunt, who you just heard from. I had previously been working with small sustainable farms at Flocana, and before that, large scale production of orchids, herbs, and a variety of other crops for years at Rocket Farms. So I am thrilled to be hosting this wonderful group of folks here today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves and specifically ask each of you to talk a little bit about your own relationship to breeding, and then we'll get into the fun bioethics of things. So, Sunshine, are you game to get us started?
Sure. Yeah, I'll begin.
Thanks.
I started growing originally in the late 80s, and I grew all from seed from that time. And I do remember a time before powdery mildew and spider mites, and then clones came in the late 80s, maybe early 90s. And then in 2015, I made a very focused effort to make my own portfolio of genetics. And so with that, I'm a flavors person, and so I was breeding specifically to capture a flavor profile, and I also will do process for specific types of high. And one of the things that I do with my genetics is that I practice dry farming, which is no irrigation, and by doing so, it allows me to see a nice expression of those genetics grown in a fairly natural way. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Take it away, Jesse. You want to introduce where you're coming from?
Yeah, hi. Jesse, I do a project called Bioethics. That's a conceptual art piece to influence the cannabis industry towards a more ecological and community-based future. That has multi-facets in it. One of them is the Regenerative Cannabis Farm Award, where we get to award farms based off of their practices, and kind of what Sunshine's talking about. That's very specific practice, the dry farming that shows off your area. We were lucky enough to have Daniel Stein, Daniel and Taylor run Bryceland Forest Farms, which is an amazing farm. They're one of the winners of the award. And I encourage everyone to go back and watch that, that video. The interview is amazing, and he gives such good information and just real information. You know, none of it's trying to sell anything, glamorize anything. He's just thoughtful, and you can learn a lot about hugelkultur, about food production, about soil production. So thank you guys so much for putting on an amazing panel in general. I've been working with cannabis for a quarter century now. Mid 90s, I started growing my first plants out in the hills and working with seed and collecting from genetics that were in the Santa Cruz Hills. And there's literally not been a moment since that I haven't had cannabis in my life. Always been growing and having flowers every moment of my life since. It's a lifetime love affair, and I love breeding. I love working with the plant in that way. I love working with the farmers, but we'll get into that more later. Thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Eleanor, great seg into what you're working on.
Yeah, hi, it's really wonderful to be here, especially on this panel. I'm really excited about the conversations we're going to have. My background is really with medicinal plants. So I'm a trained herbalist, and I have my PhD in population genetics, and I've always worked at that intersection between agriculture and wild plants in my scientific work. And I am one of the co-founders of LeafWorks, which is a genetics company that specifically focuses on identifying plants using genetics and producing genetic-based tests to help propel farmers forward. And I'm also a co-founder of the Candor Herbarium, which is the cannabis herbarium, which gets us back to our roots of how we really define plants. Very low tech, kind of the opposite end of the spectrum to all the high-tech genetics that we see going on, but exceptionally fundamental and almost more valuable in a lot of ways. So the work there has really brought me into the cannabis space, because in working with plants, and in particular medicinal plants, we have a long history of documenting them. Our first herbariums were of medicinal plants, and they later grew into this exceptionally important botanical resource. But the medicinal plants really bring me here, and so I'm excited to continue to talk about that.
Excellent. And Nat, can you talk about the work you do bringing cannabis to the world? You got to take yourself off mute. There you go.
Thank you very much, Colleen. And I am the founder of Humboldt Seed Company and have been here in Humboldt since 1995. And you know, I think we definitely help a lot of cannabis come into the world. So that always feels good. And since it's such an amazing plant, and, you know, love to see everybody here on this panel. I'm honored to be here. And I guess I started really breeding, you know, in early 2000s, late 90s, and did a whole bunch of work doing fish biology stuff, and worked to do fish restoration and undam the Klamath, and now certainly cannabis definitely consumes most of my time. But I love the topics in the panel, and I'm excited to watch it unfold.
Awesome. Us too. So Jerry, take it away. Where are you coming from?
I'm the outlier in the crowd. I don't consider myself a breeder or a seeder. I've been around the plant for, 50 years, I guess. I've been working with medical cannabis for almost 8 years. I come in through the CBD route. I'm an old friend of Martin Lee of Project CBD. I'm writing a book for him. My son and I started LeBlanc C&E, a small family company, almost 8 years ago, distributing clones and seeds. I'm a collector. I had a software company until last year. I wrote barcode software because I'm OCD. And so I'm a collector of hemp and cannabis genetics. My motto for the seed bank has always been broad but shallow. As I said, I had a barcode software company. I'm totally OCD. I collected art with the money I made at a level that ended up in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. So today, there's this intersection I'd like to talk about between the last, 35 years that I've worked in the software industry, and the last 7 or 8 years I've worked in cannabis. And to that end, at the request of DJ Short on a panel we were both on at HempFest several years ago, I wrote the Cannabis Breeders' Rights, which is a schema that allows breeders and seeders to convey their wishes and intentions to growers and end users with regard to 3 things: propagation, sales, and attribute. And it's based on Creative Commons. I, like many people, have written everything from freeware to public domain to Creative Commons and commercial software. And the interesting thing is Azalea Software and LeBlanc C&E, barcodes and cannabis, I have the same lawyer. And the 2 corporations were set up for one purpose: to build, sell, and license intellectual property, IP. And so to me, the Cannabis Breeders' Rights is a schema, a wireframe that allows seeders and breeders to have control over their IP. And as cannabis and hemp become mainstream big bucks business, my fear, like DJ Short's, is that the people ultimately responsible for the plant will be left out of the spreadsheet when the money gets divvied up.
Great. And we will definitely come back to that. Absolutely. So my own graduate research focused on bioethics of emerging scientific technologies, which I gotta say, I'm a little surprised to be actually coming full circle to now, and that somehow bioethics is useful. But I want to start us out on what you left us with, Jerry, which is something we study in the psychology of bioethical discourse, which is the rhetoric of hope and fear. And rather than letting that be something that lies inherent in our conversation, I thought we could start by naming it and speaking to it briefly. I know, Sunshine, you and I had a good conversation earlier about your perspective on this, especially you're coming from a place where you're a farmer, you're a breeder, you're a businesswoman at the heart of this. Can you start us off once again by speaking to some of your own hopes and fears in the bioethics of breeding?
Well, my hopes really are that people will just have a very open curiosity. These genetics are fluid, and it's important to just be in the moment with it. and enjoy what you're smoking when you're smoking it at that time. And we don't need to get too crazy about it. And just to have a curiosity, because there's so many flavors out there. There's so many things to try, and to have an open mind to newness. And this is, conformity is just rampant in a commercial market. And so that concerns me. I see this in winemaking in particular. And so we just always want to be fostering curiosity and an open-mindedness for new things. And then my fear is that market forces in particular will just crush us. And so market forces, everything that you produce and you put into the commercial market, it has to be marketed. And so market forces are things that dictate what's good weed. Now, someone can come across and tell everyone, hey, this is what good weed is, and everyone jumps on that bandwagon, and they're missing out. That's why it's important that everyone stays open. And part of that openness is the willingness to want to discover what it is you like with no judgment. And so this is my concern, is that market forces will begin to limit what people can experience. And that genetics, even as a breeder, if you're not careful, you might lose something good because you didn't follow it through, or you didn't give it to enough people to try, or like whatever it is. And so it's just important that we can just maintain doing our work and not having it just get lost and misunderstood.
For sure. And I know, Nat, you had spoken a bit about some of your fears, especially picking up on some of the earlier tracks, both earlier today, as well as Eleanor and Dr. Banke talking yesterday about gene editing. And you want to pick up the conversation with how it relates to some of what we've already talked about this week?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that a lot of people on this, listening in, and the fellow panelists, we are, many of us are really on the same page and have a lot of the same kind of convictions and morals and things like that. But like Sunshine mentioned, the market forces, we live in a very capitalist country, and that drives a lot of things. And so for better or for worse, market forces dictate a lot of decisions that we all make. And I think, cannabis is a new, it's new farming, and it's something that, well, aside from, way back in the days of hemp before prohibition, but in all senses of the term, like, big agriculture, this is a new phenomena that we've got happening here. And I think we have an opportunity to maybe not repeat some of the mistakes that have happened and led to huge consolidation of agriculture and more consolidation of wealth, and try to craft regulations and rules in a way that maybe gives our heritage farmers and our small family farmers a little bit of a brighter future. And when it comes to gene editing and genetic modification, I think that that is a little wrapped in there, because and especially intellectual property ownership, and I think I'll go into that a little more when we've had a chance to hear from other folks. But yes, I share a lot of Sunshine's concerns, and I think when it comes down to it, it is just a something to be enjoyed, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And absolutely, we'll dive into that. I think one helpful analogy for diving in is something that Jesse uses and speaks to very well, which is dog breeds. Can you share a little bit more about that, Jesse, and how we might think about that in the context of these bioethical conversations we're having today?
Yeah, definitely. I love dogs, and I love cannabis. I think both species, the moment they entered my life, I knew forever they would be in my life at all times. I think both those organisms made an evolutionary strategy at a point where dogs chose to be mutualistic with humans. And that's the difference between a wolf and a dog. A dog has engaged with the mutualistic relationship with humans, and that's being engaged in our thoughts, our energies, our desires, and we use selective breeding for these functions, being in tune with the dogs, working with the dogs. And a lot of that is very similar to me with cannabis. You're taking a wolf with the dog and you're able to get something like a border collie that can move cattle, cattle and sheep, and understand tons of commands and protect. You have dogs that are formed for very specific functions, for like mastiffs for protection. There's like cane corsos that have all kinds of different attributes, both in protection and hunting, and nanny dogs. And but something we know about dogs too is rich history. We have 3,000 years ago, we have a Saluki, and that's a breed that can run 45 miles an hour. It can catch a rabbit and bring it back to its human. That's very different than what a wolf would do. And so we're starting with this old genetics, that took a lot of work and engaging with an animal for a function. And so even starting with the Saluki is starting, at a very high place. We already have these 3,000-year-old breeds that still are with us today. And I think with cannabis, we see the actual early landrace and primordial wild varieties that grow in certain areas without human encroachment, like cashmere in the forests and in the grasslands. Those varieties actually still produce a wide range of cannabinoids, of terpenes, high trichome production, turn purple, but they're smaller. They're adapted to that environment. The stuff in the forest grows low, doesn't get that much light. The plants in the grasslands grows much taller, and it's dealing with those resources. So I think it's just interesting that from an early stage, we have cannabis producing all these things. So it's hard to say that we own CBG producing plant. I think that's totally unethical. We can show that it exists in all kinds of places, but because there isn't that data collection with cannabis, or hadn't been, how do you can show anything's novel before there's the data there. So that was part of the Open Cannabis Project. We got to hear a bit from, I was a vice president on the Open Cannabis Project with Dale and Angela and Nat as well. And we got to hear a bit about that this earlier today. That project was taking data and making it prior art, as far as like showing lots of different cannabinoid profiles. And I thought that was a very cool way to show that something's not novel and that people don't take advantage of the idea of broad spectrum plant patents. And in the world of dogs, though, we have specific breeds and we have breeders, and we can go to different locations. Like, let's say we're talking about a Rhodesian Ridgeback. It's like, well, we know they were bred in South Africa areas, Zimbabwe, and we know that, well, Rhodesia, and we know the person who is doing that breeding. We know the person who developed that standard, and then we know different breeders that have worked with that, and they work towards a breed standard, and they create pedigrees. And nobody owns a border collie, nobody owns a Rhodesian Ridgeback, but they do create contracts with the people that are getting their dogs, like whether they're going to be showing it, whether they're fixing it, whether you're going to do specific health checks. And people are passionately working because they want to make the breed better. They want to bring it to a standard. They want to increase the health, or they want to increase the function or the beauty of that particular animal. And I think it's very similar in cannabis. We should be doing this as a community. We should be doing it in specific locations. We worry about monocropping. Well, that's not an issue if we're working with breeders for locations, for the appellations of an area, the terroir, the climate of that area, as well as what does that farmer want. We can breed for high production in different aspects, just like a dog can get a rat or it can guard. We can get the right trichome for a hash production. We can get the right terpene profile. We can get the right cannabinoids or high THCV or whatever it is for medical use. We can do that. We know the THC alleles. We know how to breed out THC, and so like we have hemp, which is really still a cannabis indica for a lot of the fields that are being produced for high CBD production, and it's just breeding out that THC allele. The combination of BD and BT. Allele is basically you can know what it is. Type 2 is a little more difficult to play with, but anyway, I'll leave it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great note to bring Eleanor into the conversation, specifically with regard to some of the genetic work that's being done. And perhaps, Eleanor, you can catch folks who are joining us today but weren't able to join you and Benke yesterday with a little bit of that distinction between gene modification and gene editing. And if you can speak to also what are people's concerns and what are some common misconceptions that you might hear that would be helpful to address.
Sure. This is something that's near and dear to my heart as a geneticist. I think we forget that these tools are really quite limited. We think that they're going to solve all of our problems and they're going to take over, but the genetic diversity that's held in the community is really the gold. And that's really the most important aspect of moving any of these plants forward and maintaining the amount of phenotypic diversity that we see and the immense amount of not only chemical differences that we see plants producing, but also, every other agronomic trait you can think of. Height, just like what Jesse was speaking of, how, you have a huge range in height and form and color and smell. And so it's a really exciting plant because of that. And a lot of the GMO and gene editing work that's being done is really exceptionally pointed and focused on biomass or disease resistance, but it can't also carry through all of the diversity, right? So you can take a single plant and change it or modify it in specific ways, but you're only having an impact on one particular type. And so I don't think that we should be worried that GMO cannabis is going to take over. I think that the traits that make cannabis exceptionally useful for medicinal purposes and also intriguing for our own personal relationships with the plant are much more varied and colorful than just having plants that are disease resistant. So we have to make sure that we as a community of purchasers that are influencing the market really continue to demand diversity and not just plants that happen to be resistant to botrytis or something. So I think that's important to remember, that we as buyers really influence the plants that are in the market. And yesterday we had a really great talk just about what GMO is and what GMO is not. So GMO is a really difficult term because there's no fixed definition of what a genetically modified organism is. So the lovely breeding examples in dogs that Jesse was just referencing, selecting breeds like Rhodesians to hunt lions, right? Those are complex traits. And so GMO in its greatest sense is exactly that, selective breeding towards a specific trait. And when you get into the nitty gritty of GMO, when we think of GMO, I think as a community, when we're hesitant towards the technology, the biotechnology aspect of it, it's really about plants that have been altered by taking foreign DNA and moving it into a novel organism. And so this can be between different species. It can even be across kingdoms, which is kind of crazy. So taking DNA from a bacteria and putting it into a plant. Or it can be taking a piece of DNA that codes for beta carotene from one plant and putting it into another plant. So we've done this with rice. Or it can be moving genes within the same species. so just a more accelerated way to get to something that we could, using classic breeding, get to, but over a very long period of time. And so it just expedites that process. So I think it's important to remember it's not sort of a black or white technology. It's very much a gray area where what we're doing with those techniques is really much more important in my mind than the technique itself. It's just like breeding, like why are you doing the breeding and what is the path? And so it's another complication, this whole landscape, is this concept of gene editing. And so gene editing specifically goes into a genome where you know a lot about what's going on. And so you can't do this with organisms where you have a very cursory knowledge of its genome. You have to have a pretty in-depth knowledge of what's going on. And you specifically look at a gene or an allele or any of the other aspects of the genetics that influence that gene. So it's promoters and regulators and other genetic components that tinker with how that gene is expressed, and you modify that. And so you aren't going in and bringing DNA from somewhere else and putting it into an organism, but you're specifically editing the genome of an organism itself. And so this can either downregulate genes so that they no longer produce molecules that would contribute to spoilage, right? So if you have a gene that's producing a lot of ethylene, and you don't want ethylene because it's ripening or spoiling the plant, if you break that gene, that plant is going to have a delayed spoiling. So there's all kinds of ways that works. So I think that sort of gives a summary of what we were speaking of yesterday. But I think it's really important for us to remember that those are so targeted, and they're using specific plants that, they're never going to be able to keep up with the diversity that we already have within the community.
Yeah. So then let's bring this back to what Jesse was saying before about heirloom versus land races. And Jesse, do you want to expand a little bit on the designer hybrids, the poly hybrids, and then Eleanor, perhaps you can bring the herbarium into it as well.
Yeah. I'd like to touch on something Eleanor just said too, and the reason why. And I think that's really important when we're talking about why we're breeding and what our relationship is with it. And for me, I want to learn from the plant, and I want to do things that will benefit farmers and benefit patients. And I don't want to own anything. I just want to play a positive role in and seeing what we can do with this amazing plant that's evolved with us. To bring that back to heirloom and landrace, and these landrace genetics were growing. People started cultivating with them in different areas. India and Kashmir and Pakistan, Afghanistan have very rich traditions with cultivating with cannabis, and different varieties have been produced in different areas where they've been cultivated for certain things. And you quickly see the differences between these wild varieties and cultivated varieties. One notable thing is like seed dispersal for a wild variety. It wants to be able to disperse seeds at the right time, and they need to be able to eject from the flower. They need to be able to germinate at the right time. And so in general, you get really small, really sharp, kind of lemony shaped seeds that can eject out, and then they germinate really slowly too. And they want to make sure that a temperature is right, that it's not going to germinate too soon and die because of it being too cold. So you see these very different adaptations that are happening for it to survive really well on its own in the wild. Cultivation, on the other hand, you're getting seeds. The seeds that you keep are the ones that stayed in the plant. And so you get instant morphology changes in the thickness of that seed, and also the germination becomes very easy. You want to keep the ones that germinate really easy too and quick. And so I see that, with stuff that I breed, I get this immediate germination. These wild varieties, it'll be like a long time of the right temperature and moisture for them to open up. One of the things I was noting though is these early varieties do have all of these attributes. So I don't think we can even begin the conversation of saying we own any of this stuff. But we can work on it, and we can put it out to who we want, and we can make licensing agreements. and all of that. But I do think we need to honor the cultures that have brought this. There's 10,000s or thousands of years, tens of thousands of years of tradition and of cultivation with these varieties. And I want to give a shout out to the Indian Landrace Seed Exchange and Breeders Without Borders. Deepak, who does eRasin on IG, he goes around and he documents these wild varieties that have not been affected by human encroachment. He also shows how human encroachment affects those. He documents the different cultures, the hash making, and he makes this information very available. And that's such important work. And I feel honored to be able to work with these things and make hybrids from, with Mazar or Hindu Kush, like we did back in the 70s. These are the genetics that we worked with way back when we were making our hybrids from what we might have been getting from South America, brought back with the Kushes and the Mazar that were brought over and making all these different hybrids. And those, it's cannabis indica. So we see the same kind of genetic hybrid thing happening. And the cannabis sativa thing, I don't totally want to get into, but in India, so cannabis coming from India, we have lots of different ranges. We go almost down to the equator, and we're up, we have varieties at 9 degrees above the equator, and then like some at 30 degrees north. That's going to be very different, in how they're going to grow. So we have tall varieties that get lots of sun. We have thin leaf, but we have thin and broad leaf, and tall and short versions of similar genetics. They've just adapted in different areas. So I think it's like, just because a plant's tall and has thin leaves, doesn't mean it didn't come from India. It might have came from a different location too. So it's really neat to see the genetics and be able to learn more about what we were originally working with, and then also knowing what exists right now. These same communities are still cultivating these amazing varieties, making very unique hash, and I really appreciate having that information.
Yeah. And then back to the herbarium, how does that tie in to some of the concerns and questions people have, Eleanor, about genetic preservation?
Oh, sure. An herbarium is just a spectacular botanical resource. It's a resource that's used for all kinds of different purposes, but its primary utility is definitional. And so if we find a new species in the wild, or we develop a new cultivar, in either of these scenarios, the first thing you do is make an herbarium specimen. So you press that plant and you write a definition about that plant. So it really describes all the important attributes of that plant. And the importance of an herbarium in this particular context, and especially for cannabis, is that we do have, just in the talk we just had earlier this morning, some of these overarching patents that have come out. And if you don't have ammo to present to the patent office saying that, no, this particular chemical profile is not unique, we have 7 or 8 different plants of different evolutionary histories that have this particular chemical profile, you can't make this utility patent. It's not permissible. Without these kinds of resources, you don't have the ammo to fight back for those types of situations. So documentation is really important, and it also puts things out into the common space. And so any plant that's been traded for over a year is considered public property. I think that's something we forget. And so most of these plants aren't even in a position to be owned by anyone, which is really, really important. And it's important for us to document these plants so that they stay in that arena of common good and common utility. And an herbarium is a really nice thing because it can also tell you a lot about how these plants interact with their environments. And so if you take samples of the same plant grown in different areas, you can start to understand what environmental factors are driving the phenotypes that we're really interested in. Sorry, I've got a fussy baby over here. And so in using the herbarium in all of these different scenarios, it can be used for farmers to make good decisions about what they're growing on their farm. It can be used to document things that you've been working on so that you can go back to them. So Jesse has a really extensive breeding program, or Nat's breeding program. And so they're going to document these things, and then they can show, oh, I've actually moved this population forward. This is the work I've done. And then you have added value to show that you've actually put in that time and work to then move your plants from, you know, a more heterozygous state into a more homogeneous state. And I think it's really important when we talk about land races and wild populations to know that they're also an exceptionally important group to document so that we don't lose the information that's held within those groups. And I think that this is also a very important aspect of tissue culture, the ability to preserve plants for long term. And you know, it's hard with an annual, right? So if you want to keep something going and you have something unique and special, it's really hard to keep it alive with space and time, and it might not be the thing that you're cultivating for your farm to generate your income, but it's something that's important to you for other reasons. And so tissue culture can be an added tool in your toolbox to facilitate that.
Thank you, for sure. Can we linger on tissue culture for a minute? Because we talked about that earlier this week, and also talked earlier this week about viruses, viroids, issues with pathology. Jesse, I know you can speak to perhaps a brief history of pathogens and pests in Humboldt. And Nat, I know you've experienced quite the history with regard to bans on GEs and GMOs. So we can get into that in a second. But Jesse, you want to start us off with pathological issues?
Yeah. So I think tissue culture as a tool is very exciting. You know, over the last couple decades of watching the progression in Humboldt. You know, Sunshine talked about growing before you ever saw powdery mildew, you never saw spider mites, or growing from seed. I had the same experience, but it was about the time that, the Cushes came in, that, that became more popular, that you started to see a bit more spread of powdery mildew and also spider mites. And then some of that was happening at dispensaries too, as far as having clones and people, all of a sudden you bring something in and before you only had, your own selected clones from your seed plants, or your seed plants. And so you weren't seeing that stuff. And then, people have to deal with that. Like, so people start growing a whole bunch of OG, and you can sell that pound for $4,000 or not be able to sell it at all because it's got powdery mildew on it. People started doing things like using Eagle 20, the mycobutanil, and that was a pervasive problem until people started testing for it in the legal market. And then all of a sudden you can't do anything with it because it's a pervasive systemic fungicide. So that was a kind of a saving grace. Anyway, so I was growing varieties that didn't have powdery mildew, didn't have spider mites. One day, a friend brings in plant, and then you see spider mites for the first time, and then you see powdery mildew for the first time. I was continually breeding, and one cool thing was I got to then see which plants didn't get powdery mildew. So that was, a benefit from that. And so I had this Athena Kush that I crossed with the Bubba Kush at that time that just couldn't get it. And a bunch of friends kept noting on it, like, we were having problems, a plant with powdery mildew could be falling on this plant and it won't get it. 10 years of that happened. And then all of a sudden, this one year, it started to get a little bit of PM like creeping up on it. It was like, what's going on? And I think that might've been a second variety of powdery mildew that eventually came in. So around this time, people are starting to see issues that they don't understand. The flowers aren't being that meaningful. You see brownings, hairs on the pistil. You see, just issues with growth. And we, basically rule out nutrition because it would be in different patches in different spots. And I started seeing that issue. And one day I was just like, okay, I'm looking at this leaf under the microscope. And sure enough, there's all these freaking monsters under there, these horrible little like mites just going to town. And it's like, what the heck are these? And start looking up and like, oh, there's these similar ones that attack bell beans and sometimes citrus, and it's this broad mite. And nobody knew what that was. You can't see them. They're too small. You need like 40 to 100 times magnification to really see them. And started going to the grocery stores. Hey, you guys heard about this? Nobody knew anything. And so kind of sounded the bell then, and all of a sudden, everyone has to realize there's these tiny invisible things that are gonna totally destroy their crop. And I realized, like, as soon as I saw them, I was thinking about, oh shoot, for the last couple of months I've been seeing these these issues, and people complaining about low yields and, you know, yellow and burnt hairs and all of that. And it's like, uh-oh, this is gonna be a big problem. And it was, and a lot of people closed down their indoors, restarted over, and then, you know, dealt with that. And as soon as they're dealing with that, then we get russet mites. And it's like another, you know, similar size, cause a similar problem, different bug. Apparently it was used as a biocontrol by Caltrans too for suppression of star thistles, which seems totally crazy to me too, but everyone's freaking out. Our economic crop is being destroyed. And, you know, but with seed propagation, you don't have the same problems. Although when it's being used as a biocontrol, then even seed plants can get it if they're nearby, you know, areas that might already have broad mites or russet mites in this case. So then all this, you know, now we're seeing these tiny visible things that, you know, can destroy our yields. All this time, viruses were probably, you know, coming in, and all these problems kind of come from clones, from practices, from indoor growing and keeping something for a long time, you know, which is really important for certain medicines, but it comes with all these issues. So it's really nice to be making seeds with these important stuff all the time and continuing that, because you're not going to, you know, necessarily keep a clone forever. So now we have tissue culture, we can keep that for a long time. Extremely difficult to propagate back out though. I mean, like, people aren't doing this on their own. You need to have very clean, very specific conditions to do it. And then it takes, you know, freaking 3/4 of a year to just get something back to be able to then clone with. So this is for very elite like clones in general, besides maybe just taking a bunch of tissue for long-term storage. But as far as propagating back out, you know, it's expensive and that's prohibitive. So I think we still need to be going down seeds and breeding in a big way. I think that probably most clones out there are infected with viruses at this point. They've been shared around so much. You clip with scissors from one thing, you clip to the next. One thing that got touched on was it didn't sound like they thought that the hops latent virus was transmittable through insects. I would like to see some studies on hemp aphids because their mouths are big, they're sucking sap, and they can move around. I do see that they could potentially be a vector, as well as, you know, human and you know, clipping and cleaning up your plants and going from plant to plant without bleaching. Again,
can you stay on that for a second, because I know that's something we've talked about. And by the way, you're going to need to demonstrate how the mites go again, because that was.
So I was doing experiments with them and seeing the different things that killed broad mites at the time, and actually the spinosad bacteria would make them seize out. And so, like, I was looking at them under the microscope doing this all the time. So maybe that's why I did that.
Nice. There's some real nerdy lab work for you right there. I love it. Especially now that we can do that work, and we talk about the overall arc of the development of scientific technology, and at what point it comes to markets and at what point it comes to us on the farm. Obviously, it would be wonderful if, as you point out, we could clean everything and make sure that we're breeding only from things that are free of viroids to the things that are free of pests. At the same time, and maybe Sunshine, you want to bring us back to the small farm. If you're breeding, and we have a bunch of policy wonks on the panel, right? Like, a bunch of you have helped lead the charge within our community about what we should be calling for. And to go back to that earlier dog breeding analogy, like, we can come together as a community and we can create community standards. So long as all of us are in this proverbial room together, with a number of participants here as well who have that power to create our community standards, what should ethical standard be for testing and trying to tell whether you even have any pests or viruses, let alone requiring that you clean them up before you either breed with or share them?
I'd like to add a finishing observation that will tie in perfectly to Sunshine. So doing the Regenerative Cannabis Farm Award and working with farms and breeders and looking at these farms with amazing practices, with soil building practices that have a healthy biome in their soil, that work with polyculture, that are inviting all the beneficial natives to come into their pollinator gardens, that are integrating animals, crop rotation, cover cropping. These polycultures with living soil, just like our gut biome, gives us health, and inviting all of the things to keep things in balance as far as pests. Those plants grow really healthy, and the seeds grown from that. All these regen farms, I've never seen an issue with viroid. I don't see overpopulation of different bugs. Even mildews and mold seem to be totally in control. And if viruses they're definitely around. They're in all their clones. We cross with these clones and stuff too. I don't see these issues on these regen farms that are growing from seed. So I just think that the practices are really important. The tissue culture is amazing for our breeding work and for phytosanitation, for all these different things. But I think the practices of seed breeding and living healthy soil and healthy environments are really the best solutions for pathology.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that on the practices, but also in the native soil, fusarium is there. It's just naturally in the soil, and it can be in. You can add some compost, and it can be in your compost from your veggies you buy at the store, and you put your whatever it is. You can still get it in there, and so it might just be that the tissue culture. Maybe it doesn't need to happen every time, or maybe it's just every few years. Maybe it's something like every three years you need to bring back some vigor or do a tissue culture with the clones. And so it might just be something along those lines. And there also may be specific genetics that do need it more often than others. So that's, as far as policy goes, it is, we have, it might just be that with the level of transparency that we have now, and with robust standard operation procedures, that we will see things get better with our genetics, and they will be cleaner just with best practices. But even as I say that, I think that people who are purchasing commercial plants with time, it will clean itself up with better practices. But it's good to have tissue culture as another tool and something that can be done.
Cool. Let's transition that back to Nat and some of your thoughts about those local bans on GEs and GMOs and how that might be helped with labeling.
Can I go back for a second?
Absolutely.
I heard the community talking about shared goals with regard to pathogen and disease-free plants and clones. As a product manager for 3 decades, what I hear is an SOP manual shared by a distributed work group or a distributed team or tribe. Has anyone started at the top level and said, here's our goals and here's how it breaks down into achieving those goals, and have the Humboldt community sign off on a shared SOP manual, standard operating procedure? Because then individuals can measure their progress and the community can advance those practices as time goes on.
Yeah, that's a thought.
I hear Eagle 20, I assume, Jesse, you're not a big fan of Eagle 20. Is that in writing somewhere? Is there a good list, a bad list, and it's up to you gray list?
Oh, well, no, any product being tested, it shows, and it's very pervasive. So if you're using it at all, you'll fail. You won't be able to put it in the market at all.
It needs to be in writing. To me, you start.
That's our regulatory laws. Like, you can't.
No, I'm saying as a community.
Oh, sure, yeah.
The community standards.
The thing about standards too, that's going to be very different between indoor cultivation, outdoor, and tissue culture. And there definitely are some very specific standards that you do want to adhere to if you're going to go through the cost of regrowing something out from tissue culture, doing the testing to make sure it's viroid free, and waiting that year to be able to repropagate those varieties. You damn well want to have really good quarantine practices, really good sanitary practices. You never want to reuse scissors on something else. I even encourage actually bleaching your clones. You can soak, I'm all about living soil and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But you bleach your clones, like it doesn't hurt the plant. You rinse it back off, and you've killed a lot of things. And it's just one other way to stay sanitary.
Yeah.
And I think sorry, Colleen.
No, go ahead. I was going to ask you to chime in with your thoughts on especially that balance between community standards and legislation, because I know this is something you've thought a lot about.
Yeah, well, and I think, we're talking a lot about standard operating procedures, and there's a big difference too between, clone crop propagation and propagation with seed or, germplasm propagation. And, for those, I know Daniel's on here, he runs a substantial clone nursery, and there's a lot, you really do have to, I mean, if you use Eagle 20 even 5 years ago and cut mothers of mothers, and it can still show up. And so I think a lot of us, we've learned from that for years ago, and I think it might be good as we kind of turn around and look at ethics. And I think for folks that are out there listening that aren't maybe as in depth and haven't don't know what everything they're testing for in California. I mean, it's interesting because when you look at regulation, and we're regulated to not use pesticides, and so all of the cannabis that's sold legally in California does not have any pesticides in it. But does that mean that it's grown organically? A lot of people assume that does mean that it's grown organically, but that is not the case at all. You can use as many chemical fertilizers as you want and still pass all the tests for the California cannabis requirements. So I think that what Jerry's talking about is good in that respect. And I think when we talk about genetics and what Eleanor said earlier about how it's really up to the consumer, and hopefully the consumer does demand diversity, and that will help us as farmers and help us as breeders and help just in general not to have monocropping and that kind of agricultural consolidation that happens. But I would like to say, I mean, that isn't necessarily the trend that we're seeing in California right now. And it seems to be, unfortunately, that there are certain factors in a cannabis genetic that the consumer deems to be all important, be that THC, or whether it's a specific strain name or whatever it may be. And I think that's something that we could improve with education. But with that in mind, that we maybe can't just depend completely on the consumer to make the right choice all the time. I have something that I have been thinking about for a while that kind of ties back into Dr. Venke's talk earlier about doing genetic editing on cannabis. And I guess just to be totally clear right out the gate, I'm not opposed to genetic editing or genetic modification across the board, but I am a major advocate for small farms and for our agricultural community in cannabis that we've developed. And that basically small farms have been going extinct for the last 50 years at an alarming rate. And essentially a lot of the policy can in a way be sort of blamed on that. And our current agricultural secretary Purdue said that it's either basically scale or get out, and that's your only option as an American farmer. And because cannabis is new, I think we do have this chance to maybe try to have policy not help us to not repeat history and not have like consolidation of and just big ag and turn our beloved sacred herb into just this commodity that's kind of tossed around like a, you know, rag doll in a capitalist society. And like one of the things that I don't want to be a fear monger when it comes to, you know, gene editing and genetic modification, because like I said, I'm not exactly necessarily opposed to it. But, you know, if you look back in the history of big ag, you have, you know, like the creation of soybeans that could withstand getting glyphosate or Roundup dumped on them. And that happened in 1996. And it quickly became pretty hard to grow soybeans without and be competitive without using those kinds of soybeans. And of course, they were patented by Monsanto. And so then Monsanto, wanting to protect their intellectual property and their investment, if they found anyone even, you know, growing their own soybeans that just so happened to have pollen from their patented Roundup Ready, would go after them. So you had like a case that the small farmer Vernon Hugh Bowman lost against, essentially that was an inadvertent use of those genetics in growing his own food or his own crop. But essentially in cannabis, because we have such a unique community of small breeders, and as I'm sure everybody would agree, you know, like a popular strain can come out and spread across the world like wildfire. And I guess one of my concerns is essentially if we don't keep track of what crops are genetically engineered or genetically modified or gene edited, and something comes out and it spreads across the world, like, you know, any of the popular strains that come up every year or two, and all of a sudden you see them from Australia to Amsterdam to London, and it's like overnight. Essentially, we could all, without even really knowing, we could all be breeding with someone else's intellectual property, and we wouldn't even really be knowing that. And I guess my solution, and then we could end up in the case of like, you know, Monsanto versus Vernon Hugh Bowman, where we're getting sued and we didn't do anything. We didn't think we were doing anything. Even, you know, potentially cutting your own plants and keeping plants from your own clones could be a patent infringement. And so one thing that I've been thinking about at Humboldt Seed Company, I talked to Dale Hunt a little bit about this in the past, is essentially if we were to try to get labeling, and this is just labeling, not talking about banning GMOs. We already tried that in California in 2012 with the Prop 37, and that also did look to label too, but that didn't pass. It was like 49 to 51. And in any case, you know, the proponents of that voter initiative were like folks like Dr. Bronner's, Nature's Path, the Organic Consumers Fund, Amy's Kitchen. And the big opponents were, of course, Monsanto, DuPont, Pepsi, Kraft, Bayer, Dow, Syngenta. They all contributed billions and billions of dollars to stop that. And it didn't pass. It didn't pass. So now we've kind of lost that. It's the trains left the station, so to speak, in my mind. And we don't really have, I don't think, a way to know what foods that we're eating are either modified or engineered. And I'm going to say again, I'm not like totally opposed to all genetic engineering or editing, but I do think that it would be nice for us to set an example in the cannabis industry, and we still have time to do it, and get a statute passed in California in specific. That would essentially mean either getting a group of legislators within the California State Assembly or State Senate to, and then we would have to draft legislation, which is kind of a, it's a big job. Or alternately, we could have a voter initiative, which is also a big job. You need a lot of signatures. But I kind of think, we're at a little bit of a crossroads, and I think that from a strategic standpoint for the small California cannabis company, which we all are, even probably the largest California cannabis company right now is a small cannabis company compared to what's coming. I think that is something that would be favorable to all of us, because then down the road, we know we own our own genetics. We're not paying a licensing fee to a company every time we want to cut clones off of the stuff that we have, or if we want to, grow from our own seeds. And we don't kind of end up down the road like Farmer Vernon Hugh Bowman.
Yeah.
And one way of doing that is there's something called a private attorney general doctrine, and essentially that just means that once there's a law or a statute that says genetically engineered or modified cannabis and cannabis products must be labeled as such, and if you don't label your products as such, then someone can technically take you to court, and an attorney could compensate his or herself for the time they spent. And so that creates kind of an industry around regulating rather than putting the onus on the regulatory body of California, which already, I'm sure if I asked, they would say they're overwhelmed with all the regulations that we have in California. But anyway, I just thought I'd put that out there, and that's something that it's kind of a lot, and I think we're looking for help, because I know, I'm busy all the time trying to learn metric and all the fun stuff that it takes to be a licensed California cannabis company.
Yep. Everybody in the room, if you're busy learning metric, raise your hands. Yay. So on that note, I do want to bring it back to a couple other solutions and do a quick time check. And I think we're all good to go until 2:15 if everybody else is. And then if anybody does have any questions that we can address quickly, go ahead and throw them in the Zoom chat box, and we can try to get to a few of them in a lightning bonus round. What I like, Nat, about what you were proposing is that, especially from that bioethical perspective, we all have different moral frameworks, and some people may choose to make decisions about their own cannabis breeding from a utilitarian perspective that's about maximizing the good that can come from it. Others have a more virtue ethics or values-based framework that says that it is about the values inherent in this, and the pragmatic consequences are less relevant. And you and I may never align, because we may hold these values dear, each of us. However, what you're proposing about labeling is that at least we can each look at a given cannabis clone or product on the shelf and make a decision about, does this align with my own ethics and with my own framework? And I might make a different decision than you, but at least we could each make our own decision. And I think that notion of consent and autonomy is one of those that is pretty consistent across a number of different ethical frameworks for that reason. So as far as a policy battle to pick, that certainly is one that I think a number of folks in the community can get behind for sure. I know Sunshine is working on some cool things within your own business that I want to share as a solution to some of these bioethical issues we've raised. So Sunshine, do you want to speak to how you're tackling ownership issues?
Yeah, the way that I'm doing this is that after I've explored a strain and I've decided that this is good, it's time to release it, I'm turning it into its own brand. And by doing that, I'm giving it original art. And the idea behind that is that I can license not the genetic, but use of the brand. And what that does is that allows me, because one of the things about having your own seeds is that if another grower grows them and they don't grow them to your standards, word's gonna get out, oh, that's such a horrible strain. Oh, I'll never grow it. Oh, they can't grow it to its fullness. And so by licensing the brand with that agreement comes the standards, so that when the consumer sees that art, they know, they're like, oh, there's gonna be quality in that jar because it comes with quality standards. And so that's the way that I'm doing it. And my strategy right now is that it's credit over profit. So what that means is that other growers can grow my strains, but they don't necessarily have use of the brand. And I'm looking at more licensing agreements within my market. I'm not worried if someone takes my genetic and takes it to an entirely different market that I'm like not in, I have nothing to do with. That's where my credit becomes important. And so it's like, because then they're taking my work and then they're making something off of that. And at the same time, I'm learning something new about my genetic that I didn't know before. So that is my strategy currently at the moment.
Appreciate you sharing that. I know a number of folks are all grappling with their own strategies. So it's awesome to hear what other smart folks are doing.
Ask you a question. So have you done any licensing with another farm with those standards, or do those standards mean that you grew it in your location in your dry soil, in your dry farming?
No, yeah. So I haven't done this yet, but it's very close. I haven't licensed. I do not have licensing agreements at this moment, but that will come in the future. And I will be choosing, so people can grow in different ways, as long as they just got to be good growers, and they can be good growers that grow in entirely different, they can be in different mediums. It doesn't necessarily have to be dry farming. Yes, it could possibly be an indoor grower. You never know.
I love this example. Well, one, I think it ties into the dog example too, because certain breeders, if you're going to get a dog from them, you have these standards of whether you're going to breed or do health checks or, raise it as a working dog or as a show dog or as a pet dog. And yeah, so it's just really interesting. And I think Jerry's Cannabis Breeders' Rights is a similar thing like that too. We get to go through a checklist of what we feel comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Can we get to that? Jerry, do you still have that handy? Can you share a quick summary of what that looks like?
Yes.
Awesome.
Did anybody see this? I think did I just share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this goes back several years. I was on a panel that I didn't deserve to be on with people like Mowgli and Rob Clark and Sonny Chiba, Don Wirtschafter, and DJ Short. And this is the quote. The video, I have a page on leblancstini.com that references, it's a YouTube of this panel. And at the 38-minute, 45-second mark, this is what DJ said. And the buildup was, you have to start with something. No one's spontaneously generating new cannabis genetics. So his fear was that someone would take Blueberry or any one of his strains, advance it in their own way, in their opinion, and then have restrictive licensing downstream that prohibits DJ from working with his own material. When I heard this, I said, I volunteered, hey, look, sounds like Creative Commons, where you can assign the rights that go with derivative works. So when I looked, and this is the esteemed panel I didn't belong on: Malkley, Rob Clark, myself, Sonny Chiba, DJ, Don Wertchapter. So I went home, and and the background is I've been writing software for 35, 36 years or something, and a bunch of hippie, radical, free stuff to advance the world in my direction. So when I looked at Creative Commons, which I had been using for my own software, it was specific to digital content. It didn't have a one-to-one relationship with cannabis. I was aware of Open Cannabis Project, open source seed initiatives, and other things. What I didn't want to dive into were legal constructs like patents, because I don't necessarily believe in patents. And so there, again, CBR was inspired by Creative Commons. It's a licensing schema that allows a breeder to convey their wishes and intentions to the end user, to the grower. Now, as my father taught me, locks keep honest people honest. If you're going to sign up to have one of the 27 designations for cannabis breeders' rights, the minute you walk away, you can do whatever the hell you want. Locks keep honest people honest. But at least it provides a framework, a shorthand, a standard where breeders and seeders can say, oh, look, there are 27, I chose number 4. Here are the terms. It's on academia.edu as a reference. You can elect to subscribe to it or not. CBR is non-exclusive. As I said, it can be just like Creative Commons, which can be an overlay to other licensing schemas. And by choice, there is no enforcement component to CBR because I don't own it. I'm not, Linus Torvald with regard to Linux. Once it's out there and adopted, it's the honor system, which I think is fair. So there are 27 different combinations of 3 variables. Propagation. Is propagation allowed? Can you clone? Seed production, breeding allowed, or no propagation? Commerce. Can you sell it or should it be free? And attribute. Do you want to give credit for it? So as I look at my own stuff, the top of the chart is more restrictive and the bottom of the chart is a free-for-all. There were a couple of iterations of this. This is version 2.0, 2.0.1 actually. I went back to DJ a couple years later and he had slept on and said, oh, there are a couple use cases you didn't consider. The idea is that in marketing, on the packaging and everywhere else, there are glyphs, just like the recycling glyph or the non-GMO or vegan or whatever, that say CBR, these are the 27 combinations. So here's my deal. The days of selling a 10-pack are over. It's great for medical patients or for gardens, but we're in the land, or we're in the time, or in the era, if you will, of farms. People are growing cannabis, whether pot or hemp, on tractors across acres, and they're buying seeds by the pound. Now, it's been said before in this presentation that if I buy a 10-pack, pull one seed out of a pheno hunt, I can clone or tissue culture that, make millions of dollars, and the original breeder or seeder sees none of that. That ain't right, that ain't fair. So CBR is a way for the originator to have influence as their product moves through the supply chain. My big fear, being a revolutionary and living in a capitalist context, is that cannabis and hemp are other commodities sold by the 1%. And we all know that money and power in this situation are synonyms. And I don't want money to be made and the power transferred to, Bayer, Monsanto, Dow, DuPont, Syngenta, and everybody else. So that's my whole thing, is changing the balance of power between those that make the plant and those that sell the plant. So again, here's my nerd software thing. Industry standards aren't laws. They work because a critical mass of people believe and subscribe and use it, which says that CBR will work once people use it. It's free, as in beer, so why not? I've heard people say, oh, Jerry, you're so idealistic. True. Free doesn't work in the post-capitalist environment, which I say bullshit. Linux, Wikipedia, Arduino, if you're Deadhead, Internet Archive for all those recordings, all of this stuff is free and under a license that has no enforcement. No money changes hands between the licensing agent and the people using the license. So, again, without something like CBR, we all run the risk of having DJ Short's worst nightmare come true. So again, it is recursively, Cannabis Breeders' Rights is on academia.edu, released under a Creative Commons license, because I believe in open source software. It is not done. It ain't finished. It's a living document. And I hope someone on the panel or most of the people watching this online disagree, have feedback, corrections, edits, or think I'm just completely crazy. So in a nutshell, that's Cannabis Breeders' Rights. Again, it's on academia.edu. It's on my website with an FAQ, and embedded is that video where DJ thinks out loud and I come up with what I think is a possible stopgap measure until there's something better that comes along.
Awesome. Thank you. I think disagreements are the stuff progress is made of. So, yeah. On that note, anything else that any of you would like to add?
I mean, I could just say the opposite, which is someone steals your credit and they use your name on something that you did not create because they just want to use your name because it gives them credit. And that's another something that could happen in the future too.
So I say this is a stopgap method because, until recently, because it was a controlled substance, even a trademark for a cultivar name was a big deal. You could do it at a state level, but not at a federal level. The problem, so here, I'm the son, nephew of my father lawyer. My father and uncle were both lawyers. And the saying is, shoot, I'm going to forget it now. If the law's against you, argue the facts. Facts against you, argue the law. If they're both against you, pound the table, make a lot of noise, and appeal to the jury. So right now, if someone steals your shit, you don't have a leg to stand on. And until recently, being a federally controlled substance, the court may or may not be sympathetic to your case. So this is an attempt in the interim to give people and their lawyers something to fight back when they do steal. Again, locks keep honest people honest. I know because I know how to pick locks. So there's nothing any of us can do to prevent intellectual property theft. If I had $1 for every time someone stole my blankety blank software over the 27 years I owned the company before I sold it, I wouldn't have had to work 27 years.
I'm like saying the opposite. It's they don't take your genetic, they have their own genetic, and then they use your name and say that you created a genetic that you did not create just to give them credit. So it's using your name, not even so much it's not your IP, it's just your name that they take.
Well, it's funny because I live in Seattle, and several years ago, the Seahawks went to the Super Bowl, which they won. The playoff game that sent them there obviously was on a Sunday. I'm here to tell you that Monday morning, one dispensary had a strain called Beast Mode. By Wednesday, after it hit the TV stations, everyone in town had Beast Mode. What was it? I got a pile of stuff in the back I haven't been able to sell. Everybody wants Beast Mode. Yeah, I got it. So that level of disconnect between a name on a menu and what really is in your joint can't be fixed at this point.
That can happen too, but yeah, that's separate, but yes, that can happen.
All sorts of problems.
There are challenges, I mean, it's a furtive industry coming in from the dark into Main Street, into the real world. And it wasn't perfect before, and there's no expectation on my humble part that it's going to be perfect the first or second iteration coming out into. It isn't even legal across state lines, across the whole country yet.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you know, I mean, so Analytical 360 is the testing lab here in Seattle, and John Brown, bless him, approached a friend and I and said, hey, you know, when people bring in samples for cannabinoid testing, they fill out the name on the form. When we hand their results back to them a week later, we know damn well that wasn't what they said because we saw the cannabinoid and terpene profiles. Now, the issue is they paid for lab results out of the machine. They did not pay for our interpretation, and they sure as hell didn't come in to get a check on whether the name they gave was really the real deal. And John said, I don't know if you were lied to by the person who gave you the clone, or you're lying from here forward because you're trying to sell beast mode or OG push or whatever people want.
And so many fun conversations to be had about all the things labs can share with us as well. But on that note, I want to pass it off to Jesse's trying to say something. There you go.
Hey, so yeah, maybe to bring it back to dogs again, you know, all the specialized functions that they have, you know, to get rats, to guard, to hurt, all those things. Cannabis gives us all of these things. It, we have ropes, we have seeds, we have oils. I mean, our sails boats, like we were powered, you know, to travel across the oceans with these canvas sails to make ropes. And then the medicinal qualities and cancer, epilepsy. I have firsthand viewed this be the best medicine in the case of some of the most serious illnesses. The whole cannabis community was born out of the AIDS epidemic, as far as 215 and the work that Dennis Perrone and the compassionate caregivers at that time, Brownie Mary, that this was the best medicine to relieve a horrible suffering during a very tragic time. And so we need to keep that in our heart. Like, this is a plant that has evolved with us, that wants to give all these gifts to help heal us. And so when we do work, we need to be thinking about it in a mutualistic way. How can we better our relationship with this plant, with all humans, and with the planet? And so we need to learn from her and how we grow and how we interact with our community. I think that we need to be open, and I think we need to be transparent in our processes. And so we've seen a lot of tools that I think could be very useful. I'm not against tools, but I'm concerned about how they're used, whether that tool is genetic engineering or that tool is legal restrictions or patenting. Those, you know, I am terrified of not being able to do the work that I want to do, and other people being able to do that work to help and better our understanding or relationship with that plant, and to bring out all of the variables, all the opportunities that this amazing genetic potential this plant is gifting to us. How quickly she provides exactly what we want is outstanding. There's nothing like it. Like, whatever we want, we just put that power, that intention, that love, and work and observation into it. So, you know, if somebody's genetic engineering, somebody's doing certain farming practice, being super open with that and transparent with that. With breeding work, the way it's worked with dogs is the breeders that are super open with their genetics, their practices that they work, those are the people that people go to. So I think, like, empowering yourself, the work that Sunshine's doing, branding herself in such a way that's helping the community, that's putting education out there, and it is working with these ethical issues. We do need to support the small farmers, and they do need to gain from their work and breeders, but let's all do this mutually. And so thank you guys. I think this is part of the solution, is the sharing of education, of knowledge, and wrestling with this ethics. So I think just these kinds of panels and the discussion that Daniel and Adeline brought, thank you guys for all of this.
Yeah, that is a wonderful note to end on. Thank you, Jesse. And big thank you to Daniel and Natalie and everybody at HCGA and Hendrix for making all of this happen this week, and everybody who has joined all of these discussions throughout the week and continues to join each other in community wherever we all may be. I'll leave the last words to Daniel and Natalie, and thank you all again so much.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, thank you for all attending. I'm glad everybody got to be heard because there was a lot of important tools that were presented. And I think the things that Nat brought up and the things about contracting, they're really important to look now because like Nat said, without our knowledge, the next big clone could sweep across the country and we could all grow genetic engineered cannabis, and that's fine, but we should all have the choice to do so. So thank you for attending. Heather, do you want to say any closing comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to give one last thank you to all of our sponsors, Tag Risk Insurance, Rocky Mountain Cannabis Consulting, RadSource Technology, Volks Amendments, and the HCBDC. And I also just posted our link for HCGA to sign up as an allied business or as a licensed cannabis business. So check it out. And if you click there, you can see all of our members and all of the businesses that are in our network. And, it takes everyone. So if you want to join up, please do. We'd love to have you. And thank you so much, Daniel and Hendrix, for helping us put this together. We really want to do more productions like this. I think, like someone said in the comments, we need to do this 10 times over. We just need to keep doing this. So thanks again, everyone. Keep your eyes peeled for more things like this happening, and stay healthy and safe out there. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.